So chord naming shifts. So we have the modal bass chord. Now, the same thing with the intervals happens with the same thing on the chords. We have this renumbering thing that makes us name the intervals based on forcing us to make the first one the one, right? As though we're in a different scale. And we have to make that the one instead of a nodal point, which would be 0.0 typically if we're looking at a node. Same thing is based on the chord construction. So when we look at normal chord construction, remember the idea of a chord is that we don't have the straitjacket of sheet music, which is too restrictive. That's like Beethoven is saying, hey, you play something that's slightly different than this. You didn't do it the way I said, and I'm the genius, right? And that's like, okay, that makes sense because Beethoven's the genius that's writing down the thing. It's like, okay. But when you start into other songs, other genres, such as in particular blues or jazz or something like that, you typically want the general outline, the kind of idea of the chord so that you have room to improvise within it. So that's kind of the idea of the chord system, to have more flexibility. However, we still don't have a lot of flexibility because I'd still like to maybe list out spread chords or something like that, because that might be the general idea of the song, meaning one of the notes is an octave up. And I'd still like to be able to look at the chord and say, what's the center point of the chord? Maybe change that, add notes to it or subtract notes, be able to list out a bar chord, which has repeated notes in it, or an open chord or something like that. So you can imagine a chord system that is a lot more, can do a lot more, and is not tied to the idea of having the major scale as like the dominant scale that everything else is made from. They're all interwoven. They're all connected. You can derive all of the other modes from any of the other, like you can derive the major scale from the minor mode or minor scale as easily as you can derive the minor scale from the major scale. There's not one. It's like if you think about physics and where they come to the conclusion, Einstein is saying, hey, look, everything is relative. We're not in a special location when you're trying to think of our relative positions, right? The same thing is kind of true here. We got to this idea that the major scale is the position we have to view everything from, but in reality, it's not. It'd be better. I mean, if we at least recognize the fact that that's not exactly right. Anyways, modal-based construction. So again, you might say that you've gone too far on this. You're making up your own chord naming system, and that's fine. But when we get to this will be a ways out. Then I would say you have the same basis of the argument. You can say, okay, I want to see would this be logically the way I would do it if I was going to build the system from scratch without the kind of like the constructions of history, if I was just to build the system at this point in time. And if so, I think logically, clearly it would be something like this. Then the question is, well, is it worthwhile for me to kind of learn a different system, or should I at least just be aware of what might be done today versus what I'm working with, so that I can at least understand and think a little bit out of the box, or not let the language, don't let the language force you to think a certain way. And I say that with everything, politics, and with in particular. don't let the language like force you into like a box because of the definitions they put in. So we will define chords by modal notes rather than major minor triads. So example X3, XG3. So in other words, I'm going to say, instead of saying this is a major or a minor, I'm going to define it by, in essence, the mode. Now you might say, hey, wait, if I have a triad, the mixolydian, if it's a 3-note chord or a 4-note chord, or let's just say a 3-note mixolydian, I'm going to say this is a 4-note chord, but we'll talk about that later. If it was a 3-note mixolydian, it would be the same notes as a 3-note Ionian. That's why we call it a major and a major. And it's true that those would end up being the same notes, but the mixolydian is in a different place on the fretboard. So if I build the shape around the mixolydian triad, it's got a different shape. So if I start adding other notes in it, then it's gonna be different. So I really think that if you looked at it from that perspective, it's gonna sound like it's more difficult, but I think it's more easy and more natural to what you're actually doing, which is moving around nodes within one master shape, as opposed to going from scale to scale, different scales, either Ionian or major to major, Ionian to Ionian, or major to a Mixolydian or whatever. So inversion and spread awareness. So our system allows easy labeling of chord inversions, spread voicings, and non-root based naming. So again, you can imagine a system that would be a lot pretty easy to do more than just label 3 chords. Now, normally what happens is you say, I'm going to build off the triad, which is thirds, distances of thirds stacked on each other, and then I can build further on top of those with the major, with the major being our primary tool of measurement, the major scale. But that doesn't really allow us, and then we're going to say, well, then you can do different voicings. If you're playing the guitar, you can do whatever you want. You can add other things that are in that voicing, or add octaves or play within different octaves. However, although you might not want to go to sheet music, which is too restrictive, you might still want to say, hey, look, the thing that's cool about what I'm playing here is it happens to have this octave up of the third in the triad. So it's a triad, but the third is an octave higher or something like that. That's what gives me the feel that I'm trying to go for. I would like to be able to list that out easily in a chord name. Or I might say, hey, look, the thing that makes this cool is that it has an added note in it of some type. I would like to be able to add a note or something like that. So we'll come up with a system where you would think if you were building it from scratch, it would be fairly easy to do something like that, which isn't as restrictive as sheet music, but gives you more flexibility to write down exactly what you want in terms of spread chords and stuff like that. So we introduce modal step distances both forward and backwards for deeper comparison and analysis. So we might also say, like, if you're building a chord and you're looking at the modes, remember that you can kind of move forward and you can move backwards. So we could come up with a system which makes it a little bit easier to visualize what you're doing on the guitar, and then basically write that down. Again, that's kind of getting into the weeds. I'll make the argument for it in future presentations, and you can, I'm just following the logic. You can do with it what you will. So what's next? In upcoming presentations, we'll dive deeper into the rationale behind each change, the historical origin of the traditional system, and bridging tools to move between the traditional and modal systems seamlessly. So we're going to go into this in a lot of detail on each step. And each step along the way, I'm going to make the argument of, if we were doing this from today, I believe we would do it differently. And I think the system would be better or faster or easier to learn for some reason. I think everything I'm looking at that I can convince most people of that. I think a neutral jury would say, yeah, that's true. And then if we accept that, then of course that leads to the question of, well, is the speed of learning that way worth me taking on the fact that I'm going to have to also be able to bridge that to the historical system to make that argument? We're going to look at the historical system, how it was put together, and that will allow you to make the argument if it's worth learning 2 systems, or if you just want to be aware of one of the rationale. And then we're going to go into, if we're going to look at both systems, bridging the gap, how can I look at the new system and still be able to bridge the gap, just mentally, logically, as well as with tools these days like ChatGTP, where you could just say, hey, look, ChatGTP, these are the rules I'm using. And ChatGTP, by the way, is great. I've run this by ChatGTP and other AI tools to see if it makes sense logically, and it could just transpose back and forth. So that means that without even a database program designed specifically to transpose, you could just tell the system your logic. Hey, look, this is the way I want to structure it on a modal system. Take this sheet music or take this tablature and convert it. And I think the AI, if not there yet, will soon be to a place where that can happen. So keep that in mind.